Hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Norcross, along with Luke Dorris, and welcome to our podcast number 3 of hurricane season 2020, and podcast number 41 in our series. Luke, how about that?
Has it been that many? You know you're doing well when you've got so many. I'll go back and listen to them from time to time, and I almost completely forgot the conversation, and you pick it all right back up immediately.
There's
a lot back.
There's a lot on there. So if you follow our podcast on your podcast app, this can really amuse you here. Go out and get some exercise and listen to podcasts. That's what I do. Well, today we're going to talk with Eli Jacks of the National Weather Service headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. Now, you may not know Eli's name, but everybody who pays attention to the various sorts of National Weather Service alerting, watches, warnings, advisories, and all that, they're going to be impacted by the work that Eli is doing, because they're in the midst of a plan to change some of those very basic alerting terms that we're used to. It's called the Hazard Simplification Project, or just HazSimp, and the idea is to streamline a large variety of alerts that are produced for all kinds of hazardous weather in the U.S. So we have a lot to talk to Eli about coming up here in just a few minutes. We're recording this on Wednesday, June 25th, 2020. If you're listening at some point in the future for the latest weather, tune into Channel 10, of course, in South Florida, or local10.com, where we stream all the Local 10 newscasts, so you can watch them wherever you are, on your phone or anything else. And there's the Max Tracker Hurricane app to keep up to date on any National Hurricane Center advisories, and the Local 10 Weather Authority app for current information, your radar, and anything like that. And on local10.com, be on the lookout for my newsletter. It's called From Bryan Norcross. You sign up on local10.com, and then you get it emailed to you, and I'll keep you up to date on everything going on in the tropics on any day that there's anything of concern or interest. You'll get it in the morning. Just go on local10.com and sign up for that. All right, Luke, in the tropics right now, we had Tropical Storm Dolly, the D storm, another one of those kind of subtropical formation kind of things, but it was sort of a surprise that it actually spun up as nice as it did.
Yeah, if you looked at the envelope of some of the models, where it formed was south of the entire envelope. Mm-hmm. So it was able to sneak in. There was kind of a big, broad circulation, but it was looking like the mid-level spin was going to go over cold water. But there was this little pocket of warm water, and that was the question. Is it going to go over the warm water, or is it going to go over the cold water? It looked like it was going to miss the warm pocket, but it was able to develop underneath that and tug everything further south. And it was kind of a little surprise. The Hurricane Center had the formation potential chances going down.
Right.
And then the next thing, you've got a subtropical depression, and then you have a full-on tropical storm out of it. So brief-lived little thing out there in the water, but interesting.
It went from 10% to 40% to 30% to 80% to we're issuing advisories. But it really was. It was one of those things where a little bit of distance would have made a tremendous difference, because it went over the Gulf Stream. It went right over the center of the Gulf Stream is where thunderstorms formed, and that there was enough spin going on to get them going.
So the earliest, is it the earliest or the third earliest D storm on record?
I think this is the earliest D storm.
Okay.
Because we were at the earliest C storm, right? With Cristobal.
And unusually far north, too, for
yes.
this early in the season.
Yes.
And, amongst all of that, the talk has been tropics are quiet because of the dust. Everybody's heard about this massive dust plume that's blowing across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and at the same time, you're like, here comes a tropical storm. But it's not really tied, is it?
No, it's not, because the way this storm formed, it formed from a northern winter-timey kind of system, the kind that we see early in the hurricane season and late in the hurricane season as winter weather is beginning to affect the Atlantic areas. And that doesn't have anything to do with how big hurricanes form out where all the dust is now, keeping the tropics under control. So even though we're up to 4, and by the way, in the modern era, going back to 1991, the fourth storm on average forms August 16th. The D storm forms August 16th, and the first hurricane on average, by the way, forms August 14th. Again, in the modern era. Now, you go online and go on the National Hurricane Center site, and you'll see all kind of variety of dates for when these averages happen, but generally the ones you see online are for time periods either from the 80s through the 2000 up to 2010, 81 to 2010, which is sort of an official 30-year period that we operate with, or sometimes they go back to 1950, or sometimes they go back to 1900. But the thing is that in the modern time, we have, first of all, just the way the world is set up now is a little bit different. But secondly, we just have different technology. And there was a time in my time doing hurricanes that Dolly would not have been named. It was involved with an upper level low pressure system. It was going to be short lived. It just wouldn't have been named. Not to mention the storms earlier in the year. What was Bertha? The one that lasted Arthur and Bertha. But Bertha lasted 4 hours, right?
Yeah.
It just wouldn't have been named because naming it really didn't make any difference to the impact because it wasn't going to be a big impact storm. Anyway, it was a little different kind of thinking back in the day, and we didn't have the high resolution satellites to see the detail of it all anyway. So the stats on when these things happen, as far as naming and the number of the storm, the letter, and all that, are fuzzy. At best.
Nothing to get too wrapped up in with the stats. People are saying it's 2020, this awful year, and here we are breaking records with the tropics, and not really.
Not really, right. But having said that, we don't really see anything obvious going on in the Pacific or in the Atlantic or Africa that would lead us to believe that it will be a quiet hurricane season. Right? We don't, the factors that we normally look at all are pointing either to a neutral-ish or slightly up hurricane season. So if you already have 4 and you only have a normal modern hurricane season, that would be about 14. Now we would have had 1 by now on average, so 13 plus 4, so that's 17 just being average. So the numbers that people have been throwing out of 18 or 19 or something like that is only slightly above average when you really think about it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, let's bring in Eli Jacks. His title is the Chief of the Forecast Services Division at the National Weather Service headquarters outside Washington. Hi, Eli. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Bryan. Thanks for having me on today.
So before we talk about the hazard simplification project, which I know is a big thing that occupies a lot of your time, what does the Forecast Services Division do, and how does your unit fit into the National Weather Service?
Okay, well, the Forecast Services Division, Bryan, oversees what we call our 11 national service programs, and those programs oversee the policy for all of the services that everybody knows about. So whether it's the hurricane program or the severe thunderstorm, tornado, or severe weather program, winter weather program, even space weather, tsunami, climate, water resources. So I didn't name all 11, but you get the idea. All of the hazards that we have to deal with in the National Weather Service. And so the Forecast Service Division falls within our Analyze, Forecast, and Support Office at National Weather Service headquarters. So that's really where all the policy for what we do in the Weather Service emanates.
Wow. Amazing.
Eli, tell us a little bit about you. Let's tell our listeners about your background and how did this task of HAZASIMP fall to you? Tell us about that.
Well, I think it fell to me from somewhere, Luke, but it was really back in 2011, and I'd been in the job for a long time, examining our policy, and going back to when I was growing up in New York City back in the 60s. I remember listening to the radio and listening to all the watches, warnings, and advisories. And then I'd stand on supermarket lines and watch people completely mess up what they all meant. And after many years of going through that process, I finally decided, I'm actually in a position where it would be worth taking a look at what we might be able to do about this. And so it started small and did a few surveys back quite some time ago. This project's been in effect for quite a while. So I was sort of doing this on the side in addition to my regular job, but it fit in with my regular job because we were getting feedback from what we call service assessments. These are studies we do after major events that take place about how our terms are confusing, the watch and warning and advisory headlines to not only the general public, but also sometimes our partners. And so the project continued to gain momentum, and we've actually reached a point now where we're proposing a final solution to what I believe has been a long-standing problem of confusion.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. So I'm trying to remember when you and I first talked about all this. It's been, I don't know if it was 9 years ago, but it's been a long time ago, I know. And the idea of simplifying kind of the alerting soup that exists in the way we communicate. And you said that it started kind of by your noticing, but was there a time that within the National Weather Service it became an official project? And when it did, was there an expectation of how it was going to end up, or was it a road that you were going to follow to, try and figure out how was a better way to do it by looking at different ideas different countries in the world use, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, Bryan, first going back to your initial question, I think it probably was pretty close to 9 years ago where we first met, and you attended our big workshop that we had in Kansas City in 2015, right, where we brought in partners and emergency
5 years
managers.
Ago. Crazy. Yeah, it's hard to believe that was 5 years ago. I mean, I remember that so well. Yeah.
Time is just flying by.
Yeah.
And so, but in any event, you asked when it became an official project, and what I would say it became an official project is when we first integrated social science into the mix, and that's been very important. As I often say when I'm speaking about this, I'm a meteorologist, you're a meteorologist, we have hydrologists as well in the Weather Service and many other professions. Not a lot of risk communication specialists, and so I had the good fortune to work with some very talented social scientists over the past 5-6 years, and there were many phases of the project which we can talk about that they got engaged in, but this is now very much integrated into our planning. So of course, Bryan, you've heard, and Luke, you've probably both heard about our Weather Ready Nation initiative and our focus on impact-based decision support services, and a really important part of that is to make sure that if we're messaging to people that they prepare and they act accordingly, that they do so in the way that we intend. And so foundational to that is to ensure that they understand our language and that it's not just an inside language that we understand.
And it's tough. Communication, good, high-quality communication is so difficult. It's almost like the science has gone beyond the ability to communicate it effectively. It's tremendously difficult. What a challenge. So let's take a second and step back and talk about the system that's in place now, the warnings that we have today. Did these evolve slowly over time, or was there some master design that a team created way back in the day?
Well, Luke, it's interesting because I think the system has been ebbing and flowing over time. I believe the first warning was a tornado forecast back in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as we evolved through time, we added to our suite. We actually went through undulations in our suite where it grew, it shrank, and it grew again. And now we're doing a major shrinking of it. We have, or when I started the project, we had 122 products. And it's not just about, when I say products, people sometimes take objection to that term because we're not making candy bars here in the Weather Service. But when we say product, we mean a specific type of message with a certain type of coding for a certain type of partner. So, for example, a winter storm warning is a product, or a hurricane warning or a hurricane watch is a product. And so the more of these products that we have, the more we expect people to understand what the distinctions are between them. And when you go to flood products, for example, there's urban and small stream flooding, and there's 4 or 5 different types of floods. but as we often say, a flood is a flood. And so it's really just a matter of alerting people to what the impact of that situation is, rather than wondering. And I think, Luke, this is what you're saying about our science, trying to get to what the exact meteorological cause of the hazard is. We just want to alert people to what it is they need to do and how bad is it.
Sure. And through this process, there came a time, I'm sure, where you started to ask the users. You touched on this a little bit, emergency managers, the public, media people, what they thought. Did that come early in the process? You mentioned previously that you have some sort of feedback throughout your career, so maybe that came in. So when this project started, was that one of the starting points of it?
Absolutely, Luke. The engagement from the major stakeholder groups, the broadcasters such as yourselves, the emergency managers, the forecasters, and our other private sector partners that we work with all the time. We collected feedback from them both collectively and separately, and this was part of the guidance that the social scientists provided to us, because everybody uses and interprets the information in different ways. So we've continued down that path with every single engagement that we've been through with social scientists since 2014.
You're just now getting to the watches and warnings and advisories, kind of the meat of the alerting system more broadly. But let's hold off on that for a second, because there's a whole lot to talk about with the current project and the looking for public input and so forth. But what were the first tangible changes that you made? How are they going? How have they been received within the National Weather Service and by the people that you serve, essentially?
Well, the very first changes we made, Bryan, were back in 2017 to our winter products suite. So at the time, we still had sleet advisories and freezing rain advisories, and we collapsed those. We have a portion of the project that we're calling repair, and so that was fixing the current system while we were investigating a possible bigger change. So we collapsed the number of winter products that there were. We also did away with lake effect snow warning and made that a winter storm warning. And one of the things I always say about the project is it's evolutionary and we have to be flexible. Well, we learned from our Western New York partners that lake effect snow warning was really a very unique hazard, and we needed to keep that particular product. So we actually put it back last year. And so, but just to get back to your question, it was reducing the number of winter weather products. And another very important thing we did, which is being carried through the project, is what we call this what, where, when, and impacts format. So all of our products have a variety of, or in the past have had a variety of different formats, sometimes in paragraph format, sometimes other formats. And what we're trying to do is to really focus on brevity and on the key aspects of the hazard, which again are the what, where, when, and the impacts of it. Another piece of the formatting that's very important has to do with dealing with what we call our longer fused hazards. So in other words, hazards that either occur over a longer period or you forecast ahead for longer periods, versus our shorter fused hazards, and tornadoes and severe thunderstorms, snow squalls are great examples of that. Also flash floods. So those have a slightly different type of format. But we can talk more about that if you like.
Well, in TV, we are totally aware of the massive number of flavors of different advisories. Sometimes if you go to the National Weather Service website and you look at the nation as a whole on an active weather day, you just get this massive suite of colors. But flood alerts is something that you touched on previously. We, can have trouble keeping them straight, but I imagine that you have some users, emergency managers probably, and they may like all the detail that's in that. Say an urban flood warning versus a flash flood versus an aerial flood, that kind of thing, urban stream. Has that been your experience?
Well, actually, the experience with the flood suite is of all the changes that we propose making, and by the way, the flood suite is next. coming up later this year and early next, is to really collapse those products. And I can tell you, when I briefed this at a American Meteorological Society conference, that one really got a lot of acclamation across the board. So the information is still in the message. And I think that's one of the key aspects about the entire project is, regardless of the changes that we're making, the key information is still up front. It's still in the headline. We're just doing away with some of the confusion and having to worry about what kind of a product is versus what is the hazard that people need to prepare for, whether they're emergency managers, the public, or broadcasters.
Yeah, there's a tradition in the Weather Service, I think, and it probably goes back to the very beginning, of actually putting the more meteorological phenomena in the name of the alert, right? I mean, in tropics, it's tropical depressions and tropical storms and hurricanes, even if the danger is from flooding. I mean, it's a challenge because that's the way the system has evolved and it's what people are used to. But that came along, and all your sleet warnings and various ice storm warnings and various distinctions of winter storms. All right, so the big project right now that you're rolling out and you're getting public input on is the idea of eliminating the advisory category of alert and really only having watches and warnings. Now, people in Florida that focus on hurricanes, we don't run into this so much because there is no such thing as a hurricane advisory. In fact, a hurricane advisory is a whole different thing. It's a piece of paper, or it's a thing that the National Hurricane Center publishes, which is a whole different story, unrelated to actually alerting anybody. So this discussion really is about things that we do encounter, fog advisories and flood advisories and things like that, but those aren't as high a profile. But let me tell you a little story that I was very involved with when I worked at the Weather Channel in 2013. There was a nasty winter storm scenario that I know you know about very well, Eli, and you may remember, Luke. And it reminded me of a situation that happened in 1982, which ended up being called Snow Jam 82. And there were T-shirts, "I survived Snow Jam 82" in Atlanta, right? And I was actually doing the weather there then as well, right before I came to Miami and WPLG, as a matter of fact. Well, in January of 2013, National Weather Service issued a winter storm watch because there was this potential scenario developing that could bring winter weather to metropolitan Atlanta. And the day before the storm was supposed to arrive, it looked like, well, maybe it's not quite as bad as they had thought in terms of the amount of snow, the depth of the snow. And so they issued this winter weather advisory. And you know what? Most of the meteorologists played it down. Even the meteorologists at the Weather Channel kind of played it down. Now, whether it was because they were looking at the forecast or because an advisory was issued and not a warning, it's impossible to say exactly what the mechanism was, but it got kind of played down. So the general consensus was that the storm was not going to be as bad as it looked like a couple days before, and therefore the National Weather Service had downgraded the alert from a watch to an advisory, which I know drives you crazy that anybody would think that, because that wasn't exactly the idea. But in the watch, it mentioned, as I recall, 2 to 3 inches of snow possible. And then when the advisory came out, it mentioned 1 to 2 inches of snow possible. So that led into the kind of downgraded thinking. But looking at the weather scenario, bitter cold air was forecast to come pouring into Atlanta at about the time that the snow ban was going to be over the city. So recalling 82, where hundreds of thousands of people got stranded on the interstate in a more snow burst kind of situation than this scenario, I thought, okay, this is not good. Well, the thing was that the idea of the early snow melting and then flash freezing was never part of the public discussion. So it never really reached the decision makers. All this was a big, surprising thing to the mayors and everybody else. So in any case, people go to sleep at night thinking, okay, there's going to be some snow tomorrow, but whatever, they say it's not going to be too bad, and people went to work and went to school. Well, in Atlanta, it's a hilly place and people live a long way out. It's a monstrous metropolitan area and they live a long way from town. Well, in the middle of the night at the National Weather Service, they say, oh, maybe there's a little more snow coming. They put up a winter storm warning. Well, by that time it was the middle of the night. People already had plans of what they were going to do for the day. The state emergency manager didn't react, and it was a potential problem. Well, in the morning, people went to work. Kids went to school. And then it started to snow late morning. I remember looking out the window about 11 o'clock and big snowflakes are coming down. And I thought, maybe I'll have an early lunch here and then evaluate. And finally I said, I don't think you people need a hurricane guy around here. So I got in my car and I made it home just before the barn door closed, so to speak, because by the time I was driving home, the temperatures were falling through the 20s into the teens. There was that much snow on the road that was being compressed by the cars, and it was turned into solid ice, complete ice. Well, anyway, it was really terrible. CVS's and Walgreens and Home Depot stayed open so people could sleep in the school children got stuck on buses that they had to take them back to school. They couldn't. It was crazy. Hundreds of thousands of cars were abandoned all over the place. Temperatures. People were stuck in their cars in 15-degree temperatures with their cell phone batteries dead, and so forth. Which brings us all the way back around to, okay, the winter storm watch became a winter weather advisory, and that erroneous perception among people and professionals and everybody was that it was a downgrade, because it kind of sounds like a downgrade. Just in terms of language, it sounds like a downgrade if you're used to tornado watches and hurricane watches and other kinds of watches. So that is your current project to deal with advisories and the idea of this downgrading kind of scenario. So tell us about the plan and what are the big steps in the project so far?
Wow, I was living through Snow Jam all over again, Bryan,
Yeah.
with you telling the story. And we had a similar case, Commute-A-Geddon, here in D.C. I forget the exact year, but in the past 10 years. So, yeah, this issue about an advisory being a downgrade from a watch, you're right, it does drive me crazy. The issue is that with watch warning and advisory, we are trying to convey differing levels of certainty and severity with three terms. And so we have learned through all of our social science that actually first watch and warning sound pretty similar. And that's still a problem. We're not going to really address that because these terms are so deeply institutionalized. But we really think it's this third term, the advisory term, that gets confused with the other two for a few reasons. The first being that if you have three terms in the system, people are just going to think that they're hierarchical with respect to each other, that there's the least bad, the middle bad, and the worst bad. And so that's one issue. What we found in our surveys is that people actually get advisories and watches mixed up. And I got to tell you, Bryan, I hear it from broadcasters too sometimes. I hear it from people who are experienced in dealing with it. It's just a very confusing system. And so what in the case of Snow Jam, when you went from the watch, where the watch means that a significant event is possible, where the warning means a significant event is happening or it's imminent or occurring, the advisory has the same level of imminence as the warning. It's just in our criteria not as bad. So in going from a watch, you're going from possible to advisory happening. That's not as bad as a warning. So if I haven't confused you, I've now confused myself. But the idea being that we learned from our emergency managers as we did our focus groups, our workshops, our surveys, that emergency managers really is a core constituency of ours, our core partner. They're either preparing or they're acting. And so watch and warning, prepare, act. It's possible or it's happening. There's a number of ways that you can educate on this. And, I have heard very valid arguments from many saying, if you just educated more, the public and our partners would understand it finally. And the pushback I have on that is I think the system is just inherently flawed in terms of the language that's used, because advisory doesn't mean anything in terms of urgency or certainty. It's just advice, really. And so given what we heard about keeping the prepare and act paradigm, while also hearing from broadcasters that the advisory level of alerting, that kind of less serious than a warning level, is important, what we are now proposing is to eliminate the advisory headlines. There are 24 of them in all, and replacing them with plain language that conveys the sense that this is not the regular forecast, but it's also not a warning. And these messages will be equipped with the same type of computer coding that TV folks such as yourself or others who read our information with computers can access to color a cell phone screen or color a map, etc. And so we're in the middle of collecting feedback on that now. We've done a survey internally with our forecasters, and we had over 700 people respond. We now have a public survey out. And Bryan, as of today, we just crossed 50,000 responses. I'm just really humbled by that and grateful for the amount of feedback that we're getting, and we're going to analyze all the comments. But what we're doing is we're actually showing people what the new system would look like if we decide to go in that direction. And so that's where we're at right now.
Wow, 50,000 comments. I'm sorry, Bryan, go ahead.
Well, no, let me just follow up on the Atlanta situation, because a couple things happened. One was I came to know the meteorologist in charge of the Atlanta National Weather Service office as a result of this pretty well. And, he said, look, we're never putting up a winter weather advisory for Atlanta again if there's going to be any impact from snow on the road. It's just too difficult a place where so many people commute 30 and 40 miles on hilly highways and roads. So that'll be an interesting artifact. That from experience, but without the advisory effect, ability, if you take that away from the forecasters, it'll be interesting to see how that impacts how many warnings go up, which in the Atlanta case would have helped the situation, even for 1 to 2 inches of snow in that meteorological situation. Because I was on a committee, well, first of all, I wrote these blogs, and I really pissed off the governor. Because the governor in Georgia is the one that's responsible for setting the emergency tone. And the governor's office didn't respond to this correctly. Now, to give him all the credit in the world, once he finally came around and realized, maybe we didn't respond great, on the next snowstorm he responded wonderfully, and even late in that one he was terrific. So they did correct themselves, but they didn't get it. They didn't understand the message. And then I was on a committee asked by the mayor of Atlanta to advisory committee to talk about what they should have done, and there was one other weather guy who I don't recall, I think from Georgia Tech, on the committee with me. And the even after this event, the sense of the political and the business leadership in Atlanta was, well, if we just had better information, we would have known how to manage the day. Where our point was, no, there was no amount of information that was going to be good enough to do anything but say, don't go to work, don't go to school today, to shut down that day, right? So whatever, even after experiencing it, they didn't have in their mind the idea that an alert, just a warning would have been enough to make them not send people to work and school that day. So okay, now you have 50,001 inputs to your survey, but it is, to me, it was quite a lesson in how you impact decision making. And of course, I know now that the National Weather Service so much more works directly with these local governments and emergency managers and so forth. So that may be corrected at a different level than just the public alerting terminology.
Well, you've raised a very interesting point here, Brian, about advisories versus warnings and why they're issued as they are. Um, and something I'd like to touch on, which is our meteorological criteria. So again, it goes to more of the dorky side, if you will, or the science side, where we've defined these criteria. So for example, I don't know what it is in Atlanta exactly, but perhaps
I think 2 to 3 inches was the threshold for a warning, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So if you have 1 inch, it's an advisory. Let's say if it's 3 inches, it's a warning, right? But in the situation you described with the bitterly cold air coming in behind the precipitation or concurrent with it, that was really at least a warning. So our policy, as I mentioned, this is what the Forecast Service Division oversees. It has strong suggestions about at what level, how many inches of snow is an advisory, how many is a warning. Now, we do provide flexibility in the system, but one of the goals of the project is to not focus on criteria-based products, but to focus on impact-based information. And one of the things I would like to see happen is for forecasters to have the flexibility in that snow jam case to have issued a warning right from the get-go if they figured, look, it's going to only be 1 inch of snow, but it's happening at rush hour, it's going to freeze on contact, and this is going to be a disaster. In fact, Brian, this gives me the opportunity to talk about one of the pieces of the project, which is to explore the expansion of our emergency level of alerting. So we have in our policy tornado emergencies and flash flood emergencies, which only recently now, those are the ones that are setting off your cell phone via wireless emergency alerts. But we don't have, there was a derecho that came through here in 2012. We had no way for our forecasters to really explain that this one was different, that this was going to be an 80-mile-an-hour plus wind event, not just a 60. And so in a case like snow jam, I wonder whether an emergency level, I don't know if we use snow emergency because that's kind of a municipal term, but we're actually investigating which product should gain an emergency level so that we can express that this one is different, which snow jam clearly was.
It was. Luke?
Yeah, I was on a webinar. I was on your webinar that you'd put out, just last week, I believe, Eli? Is that when that was? Yeah. So I was on that, and you touched on how you are looking at giving the ability to knock things up and down tiers as far as warnings go, and I believe you just touched on that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So in other words, we have, and I was touching on our short fuse products, for example. So we have a format called impact-based warning format, which the name is not as important as what it enables. At the bottom of these messages, we have machine-readable codes that, as the urgency and certainty and severity of the event goes up, we're able to ratchet that up and down. And we're working with FCC and FEMA to alert cell phones at appropriate levels when there's something that's going to come and get you right now that you have to know, whether it's a tsunami or a flash flood, or a snow squall that hits with virtually no warning, that hits it on a dime. These are the type of products that to save lives and property, which of course is our mission, that we're enabling our cell phones to help us in this way.
And it makes all the sense in the world that your meteorologist would have the freedom to be able to take such action, where maybe now with the system that we have in place, they're kind of locked in because, hey, there's XYZ criteria. We can't do it right now. But with this, that makes all the sense in the world to me. I'm interested in these comments. You say 50,000 comments. How do you look at all those? And then, do you have an early sense of the reactions? I imagine you have a lot to get through, but is there a consensus?
Well, so our forecasters were pretty positive about the change. Our initial results were, in the 70s%. So just to clarify how these surveys are constructed, and again with social science support, we have a scale where you make a statement, we should make this change, for example, and you either strongly agree or agree or don't care or disagree or strongly disagree. And so we're able to see those statistics very, very quickly. Similar to what we did on the webinar, Luke, if you participated in that, we asked these questions. And on these webinars, where we've had 3 webinars, we have 2 more coming as we speak today. We've had over 1,000 partners on those webinars, and some 85% are in favor of the change in that regard. The public survey results are not as strong, and they're just coming in now. One of the things I'm wondering is, in the webinar, Luke, you recall, I spent quite a bit of time. I spent 20-25 minutes with slides explaining what the change is and how it would look. The public survey is more of a quick hit, so we give a very quick example without much context. It's hard to do. We're trying to decide how much detail do we put, how much do we want people to read, and that was a tough balance. So we're not going to have 50,000 comments. We have 50,000 responses, and then we're going to segregate the comments into communities. So we have the professional users. So we're able to segregate all those comments. We have a category which is, I'm not a professional, I just check the weather to see if I should bring an umbrella, which is pretty much what the survey said. And so we break it out that way. And then we can put the likes and dislikes together. I have a team of people who are helping me to analyze these data. So we have a good few months yet to go through all that, and then we'll be ready to take all the social science that we've done over the past 5-6 years, put it all together and make a recommendation.
I can imagine this would be a hard thing to survey, because you're asking, especially the public, about something that most people don't understand in the first place. So if they don't really grasp what an advisory level weather alert is, what that really intrinsically is supposed to mean, it's hard to ask them whether they like it or they don't like it, right? Because they're starting from some odd understanding in the first place. And then the question is, if you don't really understand the system, even if you do, you could imagine, because I know with broadcasters, you've gotten some pushback that they've said, well, we need something because we have to describe it in some way. If you're saying there is something that needs to be alerted about in this part of South Florida, then we need to say something about it in actual words. So where do you come down on those issues?
Well, Bryan, I'm really glad you said what you just said, because that is a real conundrum. I have to admit, I'll confess, I've gone out in public and I'll talk to friends or people that I just happen upon, and I'll say, so what's the difference between a watch, warning, and advisory? Do you understand it? Oh yeah, I understand it. Right. And then they go ahead and they
no, they don't. No.
no, they don't. Yeah. And so, you're asking a great question. And in fact, Bryan, one of the categories that we're establishing in our survey analysis is doesn't understand the system, right? So as you said, it's pretty hard to make a call on whether we should change a system that people don't understand in the first place. And I've heard comments that we're trying to change a tire on a moving car, because this is the system we're using, and to some level people aren't understanding it, and yet we're asking them about a system they don't understand. Should we change it? So it's kind of a circular thing. So where I come down on it is, and I didn't really give an example. So let me just do that real quick. So instead of a wind advisory, we would just have a statement that would say gusty winds today. And so, but we lose, what are you calling it? The Weather Service has issued. So as I say in my webinars, we're not suggesting we issue anything. We just suggest that we say this is more than the forecast. There's going to be gusty winds today. The Weather Service wants to alert you of this. And Bryan, you and I have had a great conversation about this. And I think this is something actually we can consider, which is perhaps use the word, hey, alert or caution in the message, in the plain language headline itself. So it's not a third headline to confuse with the other two, but you're telling people, hey, this is not the regular forecast. Caution, high wind, strong winds today, gusty winds today, as opposed to a high wind warning, which people understand the term warning in general, and they know, okay, this one is really bad. And so, even after we make a call on which way we should go, I think there's a lot more engagement we'll be doing to refine the language so that it is, plain language, so everyone understands what we're saying, and yet it still has that call to attention that I know that you're very interested in, and we all are interested in.
Right.
And I can understand that too, because if you were to take advisory out and put in something new, caution, whatever, are you really advancing it? Because is caution not as bad as watch? And you start getting into, so what word is there in the language that would properly convey what advisory initially meant to convey? And it just may not be there. So I see your reasoning with that. But I have to be honest, when I first heard about this project, I had a gut reaction to it. And that was, I didn't like the idea of dropping advisory, because on TV, we live on maps. And it's our tool that we can visually show you, and you don't even necessarily have to have a word, but I can show you, and you can probably tell by the severity of the color if you're in the worst of it or not. An advisory, at least when you got close to the event, kind of did that. I'm thinking winter. I was in Nebraska for years, and we used a lot of winter weather advisories, and it might butt up to a winter storm warning. Mm-hmm. So we would still want to clearly be able to show that. Would this HazASimp project still allow for us to show colors on a map or on your phone or on the Weather Service website? Would that still be
Absolutely. That's critical. And see, that this is all part, Luke, of not losing any of the information. So what lights up your map or your app on your phone are the computer codes that we include in our message. And so those computer codes are still going to be there for you. And so we want to maintain that profile. But, a word about color. So color visually, we learned during the course of the project that color is important, but not necessarily in the way that we thought. So in Europe, they use a system called Meteor-Alarm, and they have yellow warnings, orange warnings, and red warnings. And there are other countries outside of Europe that do that. And I have to tell you, for the first few years of the project, I said, that's where we're going. We're going to align with the rest of the world, and we're going to call everything a red warning or an orange warning or red warning. And then we went to the emergency managers with this proposal, which actually had done fairly well in some of our surveys and had come out of our workshop. And they said, well, using a color as a headline, as language, doesn't work for us, because number one, we have our own codes in our emergency management community that colors mean different things. There are different agencies within the federal government that use different colors, such as USGS for volcanoes and avalanches. We have colors already in some of our warnings that go way back, like red flag warning. We heard in Oklahoma that red means tornado. That's all it means. So, it turns out that color as headlines didn't work so well. Oh, and by the way, if you say red warning for snow, you still have to dig into the headline to figure out, well, what does that mean? But if we use the plain language and aid it with color, so let's suppose, people are familiar with traffic lights. So, orange, yellow, and red, not quite a traffic light, but people are used to seeing that kind of color scheme. So if yellow meant kind of a low-level hazard, an orange meant a medium-level hazard, and red meant warning, we could shade the messages that way. I mean, as Bryan keeps telling me, it's all about the cell phones, and I agree. I mean, that's where people are getting their information. And so we're definitely going to include the use of color, as we're already doing throughout the Weather Service, in this final solution. So that's still to be determined.
Well, I think about some people that do understand the difference between a winter weather advisory or a flood advisory and warnings and so on. They get the system that's in play. Even though a lot of us don't, because it's not intuitive. A lot of the public doesn't. Is that what you found as you've talked to people, those that do get it, like the current system, but maybe they're just in the minority?
Well, the way I look at it is that those who like the current system can easily adjust to the new one. It's been mainly the broadcasters, and I, if I can use this opportunity to continue advocating for broadcaster engagement, we want to hear from you. I understand that the broadcaster would want to be able to say the Weather Service has issued this. That's not quite a warning, but it's more than the regular forecast, as opposed to just saying gusty winds today. But I welcome working together to figure out exactly what to put in that message so that it's more clear. I guess what I say is that just a quick anecdote for the winter weather advisory you mentioned, Luke. We did a public survey and we had a multiple choice question. We had the 3 winter products, watch, warning, advisory, and we had the definitions. We asked people to do a matching game. 14% chose advisory correctly, which is far less than a random guess. And so what did that mean? That meant people were conflating it with watch. And so if you're conflating advisory and watch, it decreases the power of both terms. And what is the point of using a term that no one really understands what it means? And that's sort of where I come down on this.
So is the public input survey, is that closed or is that still underway?
Oh no, it's wide open.
So how do people find the URL, or what do they click on?
They can get it in a variety of places. Our hazard simplification webpage. Boy, I had memorized the URL, but I'm getting old, Brian.
Well, what is it? Your webpage?
Just Google Weather Service Hazard Simplification. It will come right up.
Okay.
And the survey is on that page. It's open till the end of August 21st. Now that I've hit 50,000, I'd love to hit 100,000. So, anyone who's listening, please go on and take our survey and provide us with your feedback. We have an email address, hazsimp@noaa.gov, that myself and all my team members monitor regularly. And we're including all these comments. We're taking it very seriously. And by the way, in terms of taking it seriously, we realize this is a major change. This system's been in effect all of our lives, right? And we're not spring chickens, right? And well, Luke is, but it's a big deal, and we take it very seriously, which is why we are so pleased to be getting so many comments and have had so much engagement on it. But it is time to make a decision about this, I believe, and we're preparing to do that.
And so what is the timetable for actually implementing a change? And is there anything else after this on the chopping block?
So the timetable is we are preparing to brief our senior leaders once we analyze all the data later on this year, sometime this fall. And if we get the affirmative decision, we then will have to do a lot of work. So it's not going to be an immediate change. There'll be plenty of time for adjustment. It's really a 2 to 3 year timetable, because we have to adjust all of our software. We have to adjust all of our policy. We have to train our forecasters. We have to prepare outreach materials. And there are some of these products, such as for tsunami advisories and high surf advisories, where people, really have gotten very used to these terms. And so and when I say used to it, it's in a lot of outreach material. It's in a lot of websites and printed materials, and there needs to be an updating all of that. So when I say that it's 2 to 3 years, when I brief this, most people are kind of relieved, because everyone realizes it's going to take some time. So that's the rough timetable, Brian.
I have one more question for you, Eli. Here in hurricane world, we're conscious of the perennial confusion between the words watch and warning. I mean, even here in South Florida, people are pretty savvy. They don't always get it. I think you brushed on this already, but it's just an inconvenient part of the English language where we have wah-wah. And is there any thought of changing watch to something else, or that's to stay?
We surveyed on that, Luke, and that was part of the original thought, is to take a look at the whole system. We never took watch off the table. We did take warning off the table, because that's our mission, to protect life and property, and it's most deeply institutionalized in policy and operations, and most people understand it. Watch was kind of a middle of the road, and we had collected some feedback on options. We tried the word notice, and we surveyed on that, and that did pretty well.
Until you got to the broadcasters, and we all hated it.
Well, until we got to Miami and Norman.
And yes, right.
Until we got
right.
to the Hurricane Center.
Yes, I was there. Yes,
well, and I understand it. And when we got to Norman and we shopped the idea of a tornado notice, and people said, "Well, that notice, that means it's happening right now, doesn't it?" Mm-hmm. And so the feedback just wasn't quite good enough. And Luke, I think it was you some time ago in our discussion had mentioned, what is the perfect word, or are there perfect words? There are no perfect mm-hmm. words, and we've come to that conclusion. And so the watch and warning confusion is there. But back to the education piece, with 2 terms, I'm much more optimistic about being able to really educate in a way that's more enduring and permanent, and that we, might be good to have a contest for the best icon for explaining the difference between watch and warning, or the best meme, or something like that. So, that's a great question, Luke, because we did investigate that as well, but not at this time. But we'll keep listening.
One of the other issues, just my last question, because we've kept you a long time, Eli, I really appreciate it, is about the watch issue in the United States, because people that watch us here in South Florida are used to the watch nominally 48 hours before the wind starts blowing and so forth. But 48 hours in the modern world really isn't enough alerting time. So for many years in Cuba, they've had a pre-watch stage of alerting. In the Bahamas, they have a pre-watch stage of alerting. Have you guys discussed that? I know that you work with the Hurricane Center very closely, and the Hurricane Center and the World Meteorological Organization. I mean, everybody's involved in this kind of thing. So these other systems, or slight modifications to the same system that we use, really are done on an occasional country basis. But did you understand the issue and why they do that pre-watch alerting, and is there a reason we don't?
Well, you're making an important point, Bryan, and I think, in an increasingly complex world with more and more population at the coastlines where it takes longer and longer to evacuate, I think what you're saying is we need more lead time for evacuation purposes, and this is something that's under discussion. Exactly what form that takes, I think, is still to be determined, but it's a very fair point in the mission of protecting lives and property. Giving more advanced warning to say what we know when we know it is critical. So yeah, we want to keep looking at that. Yeah,
issuing an evacuation order with no hurricane watch issued yet because it doesn't meet the time criteria is a bad combination of information that comes out before a storm. All right, Eli Jacks from National Weather Service headquarters. Thanks so much, Eli, for being on the podcast, and we'll stay in close touch. Really interested to see how all this comes together, because it'll affect all of us, literally.
I really enjoyed the conversation, Bryan and Luke. Thanks so much for having me on today.
All right,
fascinating project. Thank you, Eli.
Thank you.
Well, that was interesting.
It was. You and I, and anybody that works in the weather enterprise, we've known for a long time the system's kind of broken. Mm-hmm. People just don't understand. We get it, and then we get frustrated when the people that we're trying to communicate with don't understand it, and that's on us. Mm-hmm. So it's nice to see evolution. This is what we should be doing. When there's a problem, we should be working to make it better, and it's really encouraging to hear that Eli is taking the steps to get us, and the rest of the people that are working on that project, to get us in a spot where more people may understand what we're trying to communicate. And on top of that, I like how Eli doesn't seem too married to any one particular, he doesn't necessarily get stuck in an idea. He says that he's willing to, over the next couple of years, there's going to be more evolution. We're listening to the social scientists, because the way that the meteorologists have tried to do it isn't really working. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this whole thing shakes out.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing is the evolution through time here. I mean, in my time doing this, there was a time when I really thought that we could educate the public the difference between watches and warnings and these various things. Because most people watch television to get their weather, right? They didn't have their cell phone, they didn't have their computer, they watched television. So most people did that. And so you had an audience. But now, with younger people especially, and most people actually, we don't have that. We don't have that place that everybody goes to get their information, their weather information. They get it wherever they're getting it. So any kind of system that requires people to understand the definition of the terms is, in my mind, not a workable system in the modern world. It's just not. Right?
If it could have worked, it would have worked.
Right.
That was the time. But everybody's half paying attention to everything now. There's just too much information coming in all the time. So for you to sit down and listen to some term that needs to be explained to you, or to read some text, you're losing a lot of people right off the bat.
Right. It's got to be self-evident. Whatever the message is, it has to be self-evident in normal English, right? It can't be you have to go, oh, I don't understand what that word means. Can you explain that word to me so that I can understand the message, right? That's really where they're going with this idea of plain language within these various alerts. Also, so that when it shows up on your mobile phone, it shows up in some words you can understand, as opposed to some technical, like on my phone, when National Weather Service Miami issues some kind of a statement about something in the Everglades, it shows up as special weather statement. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. Do I need to click on that? Is that important or not, right? If it had words that told me what it was as the headline, then I would, I would just be informed better, because I wouldn't have to go hunt for the information. So I hope that that's where this HAZSIM thing goes.
That and the color part was something.
Yes.
When we entered this conversation, I'm gonna be honest, and I'm glad Eli addressed this, because I thought the same: yellow, orange, red. That makes sense to me. One is be aware, one is prepare, one is take action, and everybody kind of understands what those mean. It is hierarchical. So I was pretty convinced of that before I came in, that that's the way to go, because Europe, like you talked about, they do that. But as he got into it, I understand that would be a really big undertaking. Maybe that's something that can be touched into the future. I mean, even the Storm Prediction Center and the National Weather Service have different colors for tornado watches. So everybody would need to get on board if something like that were to happen. But that's not what they're doing, and that's the way I thought it initially was going to go. But just the toning down and the reeling in of so many different colors, so many different terms, is definitely a big step in the right direction.
Well, I think that they do have colors in their mind, but the difference is they're not going to name an alert an orange warning or a red warning, or name a watch a yellow watch or something like that. They're going to, but the idea is to try and standardize the colors that people use for warnings and watches. That is part of the plan. Now, exactly what the details of that are, that's going to be interesting. So my suggestion way back was that they put on the bulletin, when they issue their bulletin, suggested color. I mean, it's America. You can't tell people what to do, right? So you put suggested color, and then kind of professionals hopefully get with the program. And that's why it takes years to get everybody going the same way.
Ah, okay. I had a misunderstanding of that then.
But the idea is to not include it, because one of the early, I suggested, this was 5 years ago when we had the big meeting, one of my suggested systems was to have, just in warnings, 2 different flavors of warning: orange warning and red warning, and then emergency above that. Right? So you would always have, in phenomena like winter weather, you wouldn't have advisory. Advisory would be an orange warning, and a current winter storm warning would be a red warning, right? And you would actually call them that. But that's where it got in red alert and everything else, got mixed up in that. But I still like the idea of this hierarchical level of threat, where you can fine tune it by fine tuning the color, but it's still a warning.
Yeah. No, it's again, a right step in, or a step in the right direction.
You know, they do it a different way in Asia. The two places I'm familiar with in Asia, at least in Philippines and in Hong Kong, is they use a signal system. And they use the signal system, I guess they use it for bad weather, but the big bad weather that happens in Philippines, obviously, is typhoons or hurricanes. And what they do is when there's a possibility of a threat, they put up a signal 1. And then as the threat gets higher, it goes to signal 2, signal 3, signal 4. And if there's a signal 4 up for your area, everybody knows, oh crap, I mean, this is going to be really, really bad. This is like near the top end. So it is hierarchical that every storm changes, right? Because, when they first start alerting, there's not certainty. You don't know how bad it's going to be. And then as soon as they know that it's likely to be at least pretty bad, they put up a 2. And then as it gets more certain, they put up a 3. So it actually does only go in one direction, where they combine the certainty and severity into one number. And the idea is that, if a 3 is coming, that's bad. If 4 is coming, that's really, really bad. If that's what the alert is.
It seems simple enough. Yeah. It is interesting. And anytime that you do a big change like that, you have to weigh with how much your audience is conditioned to what's been going on for 50, 60 more years.
Right.
So I'm sure that the social scientists have had their work cut out for them, and that's got to be a mega challenging project. Trying to figure out the best way to communicate is nobody can figure that out. It's an unsolvable problem because it's just too tremendously tough. But it's again, I'm sure that they've considered all of that.
Yeah, in Hong Kong, I was talking to them in Hong Kong about this because theirs evolved. They have a 10 signal up to signal 10 system, but they only really use 4 of them. So they use like 3, 4, 8, and 10 or something. So anyway, because it's an old system that they realize they don't need 10. And so they only use some number. It's kind of crazy. All right, let's wrap it up here. But I do want you to remember to subscribe to our podcast on your Apple or Android podcast app, because starting next month, we're really going to get into this, and we're going to have a podcast every week, or sometimes more than one a week, just because of scheduling. So after July 4th, you'll see more podcasts popping up, and we've got big names coming, including Louis Uccellini, the director of the National Weather Service, will be on with us. Phil Klotzbach will be on with us, so be sure you set your podcast app to alert you. So until we talk to you next time, for Luke Dorris, I'm Bryan Norcross. Stay safe, be well, and we'll both see you on Local 10 in South Florida.